So I'm Laura Culpin. I've been part of the team working on the book. I've known Paul for 20 years and his work, and I know we're in for a treat tonight. A very warm welcome to you all. It's lovely to see so many of you. I think we need some more seats. Thank you for joining us to celebrate this launch of the new monograph, Paul Huxley, published by Lund Humphreys and beautifully designed by Tim Harvey. Paul was born in London in 1938. He first studied at Harrow School of Art, and at age 17, he came to the Royal Academy Schools, where he graduated in 1960. He's been a Royal Academician since 1987, acting treasurer for 14 years, and also acting president in 2002. So it's apt, of course, that we're here at the Royal Academy for this wonderful occasion. Thank you, Tim Marlow, who's leading the conversation. Obviously, writer, broadcaster, historian, since 2019, director and chief executive of the Design Museum London. Prior to this, he was artistic director at the Royal Academy, and he's known Paul for many, many years, first introduced, I understand, by a mutual friend and mentor, Brian Robertson, who I'm sure we'll talk more about. We also are honoured to have Jeremy Lewison and Dr. Hester Wesley. Jeremy is formerly the Director of Collections at Tate, and since 2002 an independent curator, writer and critic, lecturer with a specialism in modern and contemporary art. And Hester is the Project Director for Artists' Lives at the National Life Stories at the British Library, and who's also been interviewing Paul for years. So we've got the best people here to lead the discussion, so enjoy. Tim.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's testament to Paul's generosity of spirit, and I think his cunning, that instead of being interrogated by Jeremy, who's written a book about him, he's managed to co-opt four of us on stage to do a conversation with him and about him. Terrific. Paul, I remember once interviewing Bob Rauschenberg, who said that the process of making a big exhibition and collaborating on a big catalogue, he found absolutely emotionally draining. It was the most emotionally draining experience of his life. Jeremy's quite emotionally demanding, isn't he? We know this. How was the process for you of working collaboratively with Jeremy on the book, and what did you learn about yourself or your work that you didn't know before? Try.
Tim, you're right. It is emotionally draining. It's a bit like, I guess, psychoanalysis. Hello, can you hear me now? It's a bit like psychoanalysis. You sit in a chair and get questions fired to you about your past life, and you wonder how to edit things, which bits to pick out, and that's pretty difficult going sometimes. And it's not just an episode, but it's the whole damn lot right from the beginning. And I had two long interviews, really. The first one with Hester here next to me, who interviewed me for the Artists' Lives series, and that took 2 years, I think, didn't it? Hello. 4?
Yes, 4 years.
4 years, with her visiting me quite regularly with her recording machine and microphone. And I relaxed with her, and I probably gave away more than I felt I wanted to.
I know all the secrets.
And Jeremy listened into some of that later, and I think it fed into his book. But he also interviewed me then, picking bits out and querying things. So it was quite hard going, and I think I probably would have painted a bit more during those years than I did because of the distraction. But I think it was all worthwhile because I'm very proud and happy with the book that came out of it. There are all sorts of aspects to it. Jeremy's writing first and foremost, and Anna Arco's photographs of my work, I think, are brilliant, and then the printers and so on. So I sort of got a bit in control of things and tried to insist on certain aspects of the cover design and so on. So it's a product of a lot of people.
So what have you learned looking back? Have you learned things about your work you didn't realise so explicitly?
Yes, I learned that I repeat myself a bit too much. I wondered how many of you have noticed that what I've got hanging here, the very simple, highly selective group of paintings, are what I call the bookends, the beginning of my professional life as a painter, 1963, 64, I think, on that side of the room, and two paintings from this year and one from a couple of years ago on that side. So I worry that they're too similar, and that have I travelled far enough from one to the other?
I think you have, but let's bring Jeremy in at this point. I mean, it's interesting. It's nicely modest to say, do you repeat yourself too much? Paul, he's a very rigorous artist, isn't he? And there's a kind of nuance always in the evolving language, but there's definitely a sense of journey and trajectory, isn't there?
There's definitely a sense of. Can you hear?
A bit closer.
Maybe like that. Yeah. There's definitely a trajectory in the journey that he's been on, yeah. And I would say there's a huge difference between the early work and the recent work. But it's interesting that actually in recent work he's gone back to earlier motifs, which tends to happen as artists get into their more mature years, and they tend to revisit themes and interests and do them differently. So I think there is this journey, and it is a very rigorous journey, as you said, because Paul has, from more or less the word go, other than in his Royal Academy student years, been an abstract artist. And always, with the exception perhaps of these very early works, which are more biomorphic, a sort of geometric abstraction. And he's really been evolving a language of his own, and it's one that uses very ordinary vocabulary, squares and circles and rectangles, but each time changing the composition in such a way that he's creating new meanings out of these very basic elements, which is it's a syntactical strategy in a certain sense. And he started to do this at the very moment that a number of structuralism was very important in this period, and Oxford philosophy, which was about new language and understanding the meaning of language not by what it represented, but by how it was used. And that is exactly what Paul has been doing, serendipitously perhaps, because he may not have, I don't know actually whether you were aware of Oxford philosophy at the time, but that's exactly, it mirrors that sort of thing. And also if you look at the Nouveau Roman, Roland Barthes and Alain Robbe-Grillet and people like that, who Paul was reading, it's similarly a sort of stripped down language and stripped down narrative, where there are different ways of perceiving the same scene. And that's really what Paul is doing in these variations on these themes.
Esther, it's interesting, in your biography of Paul and the chronology, and I'd imagine this came from Paul, there's a constant contextualization of what you were seeing, which exhibitions you'd seen, which books you'd read, which films you'd been to see. Jeremy talks about a process of distillation. Is that how you see it? Because you're clearly open to many, many inspirations, influences. You had and have a rich cultural life. Does everything get filtered in painting, or is it just part of a hinterland? Because the temptation we have as art historians is everything is potentially an influence, and of course that can't be possible, and it's not often how the creative processes work. But how did it work?
It's a good question. I take painting very seriously. I know it's very popular now to say that everyone's really an artist. They just need the chance to kind of break through and lose their inhibitions or something like that. But I'm sorry to be a bit prudish about this, but I don't think that's the case. I believe that the moment you put brush to canvas, you're joining in a very serious and challenging tradition that you better feel up to scratch for. And that's a challenge, and you must try and be as knowledgeable as you can about your subject, which includes your own work and every bit of other artists' work and the history and tradition of painting that you can gather together that's relevant. I think it was Isaac Newton who said, if I have seen further than others, it's because I was standing on the shoulders of giants. That's a phrase that has been often quoted, I know. But you have to try and seek out who your giants are. Most of us are not big enough to climb up onto their shoulders, but at least perhaps we can reach their hem and touch it. And that matters a lot to me. Some of the most exciting memories I've had, which Jeremy has touched on in his book, in his writing, are times when, for instance, I can list them, when I first saw Picasso paintings in the flesh in Paris in an exhibition current at the time when I was visiting in the 1950s, where there was a showing a bit like I've done of early work and late work. And I was about 20 years old or something like that, or less, perhaps in my late teens. And I felt I was touching the hem of the greatest artists of the 20th century. And there it was, paintings that had just been done and paintings that belonged to the Blue and Rose period. I was struck by how huge the Blue and Rose period paintings were. Many of the figures were life-size or bigger, which I didn't expect. I thought they were small, tender paintings that he'd made, but not all of them were that modest at all. They were really ambitious works done when Picasso was about the age I was when I was looking at them. And then paintings right from the studio. And I've really cherished moments like that when I've been close. I felt a closeness to great living art. I've not, I think, all that often tried to imitate. I think when I was a student, like all students, I was influenced and I imitated artists' work, but beyond that, I think I've made my own pathway, and yet I've valued those artists that I've hugely respected and met, valued the times I've spent with them, as I had done, for instance, when I lived in New York.
I mean, I knew you revered Picasso, respected Picasso, revered him, but I didn't realise quite how close or influential he'd been for you directly. I mean, I knew about the Cubist conversations, but there are moments in the career where Picasso becomes a source that you abstract from quite explicitly, and that comes out in Jeremy's text. Hester, just briefly, and it's unfair to throw this to you, I'm going to. How do you, having done the chronology of Paul's life, just how do you assess kind of influence? Because, we now say, he launched a new generation, the debate between abstraction and pop art in British and the transatlantic dialogue at that time, and then the emergence of conceptual art. I mean, how do you locate Paul, having looked through the career?
I think the thing about Paul that was a big surprise, actually, when I was making the recording, was that his life tracks and anticipates so many of the great sort of cultural moments of the second half of the 20th century. And I was sort of slightly agog, because every time I'd go to the next recording session, you were there, you met him, she took you where? Because
you did what?
Yes, well, quite. And I think for me, because I've spent so many hours talking to Paul about his life and the cultural forces that shaped to some extent his practice. It's so enmeshed for me now. But yes, I think probably Paul's modesty belies the sort of extraordinariness of his life too. And I feel that I can speak to that because now, and it's had such an impact on me, because when I now look at a Rothko painting, I think of Paul telling me about being squeezed in a car singing along to the Beach Boys with him. Or when I look at a Helen Frankenthaler, I think about those notes she wrote to you on the fridge, and how she put herself into every photo she took in, anticipating selfies. I mean, I think Paul's life has been so rich, and I think what's special about the recording we made is how we had the indulgence of time, because the life story recording methodology is that we believe nobody is born an artist, so we take them right back to the very beginnings and try and figure out what their motivations were and how they turned out to, what drives them on. And I do think, I haven't really answered your question, Tim, but it's almost impossible to unpack. I would say that I think Paul's very much, could I say, a product of his generation. You were somebody who was so driven always with your sort of intellectual quest. You have always read hungrily. You've been interested in interdisciplinary interests, from ballet to, dance. And I think probably this had a lot to do with the crowd you were running with as a very young man. And I think Brian Robertson's influence as an early mentor. Is that right?
Of course it is, and Tim can vouch for that, because very early on I met Tim, who was also a friend of Brian Robertson's, and as I said once, I think Bridget Riley quoted me as saying, he's never been replaced. And he was a wonderful man because he believed in mixing people up and putting writers together with ballet dancers, together with painters. Isn't that so, around his dinner table?
No, totally.
It'd be an amazing mixture of talents and professions and so on.
Yeah, absolutely the case. But I think also, and he had a very pluralistic approach and a range of interests, but I think the thing I took from him was his fascination with the company of artists. I mean, Brian, there were never not artists at a dinner with him. And I think that, looking back at your life and even looking forwards, you seem to have had that kind of a similar openness, but the company of artists has always been important to you. I mean, your work here from 87 being elected, you took on the most difficult role here as treasurer, your teaching, which we'll come on to in a minute. So I think that was interesting. Brian was self-taught. You clearly weren't. You went for an art education from your early teens. You were specialising early. You can't answer this, but Jeremy and Hester can. How close to being a prodigy was he? How talented was he as a teenager?
He got a lot of prizes.
Well, prodigy, I don't know. It's a very difficult word, isn't it? But I think the fact that Paul didn't stay on and do his diploma and came straight to the Royal Academy tells you something about the quality of his work. It's because he was impatient to get into art school, and he didn't want to have to stay behind, do a diploma at Harrow, but if he had done, then he could have chosen any art school. But the Royal Academy schools didn't require a diploma, so he could actually come here. And he came here as probably one of the youngest students in that day, probably not the youngest ever, but
Turner was pretty young when he came, wasn't he?
Exactly. So, but Paul was 17, I think, when 17 when he came here, and he stayed on a little longer than normal.
And Jeremy, can I just interject, because just for everybody here, he started art school at 14 because he went, in those days, he chose to go to junior art school, which is quite extraordinary, thinking back at how specialised art education actually was. Sorry.
Yeah, and but what was so interesting, I think, about his time at the Royal Academy was he was really not taught that much. His teaching was going round the galleries around Bond Street and or the Tate or Whitechapel, particularly Whitechapel, where Brian was director, and looking at paintings. And you talked about, the proximity of artists. I remember you told me how you went to an exhibition of Bacon and you walked into that show and the paintings stank of oil paint and they'd just been finished, and you really felt that you were there, when he'd finished the paintings. They'd just come out of the studio. And I think that was a very important
There were barriers
moment.
in front of the painting because the thick Bacon-esque paint was still wet.
Yeah. I
Wonderful.
should say, by the way, I did actually listen to the entire 100 hours of interviews that you did. It wasn't just a small amount. And then I did further interviews with Paul in different areas. But the resource that the National Artists' Lives provides people like me is amazing. It's absolutely fantastic. And I think Paul's is one of the longest interviews in the archive.
I'm a man of few words socially, but once Hester asks me a question, I don't stop talking, which is a bit of a nuisance, I'm sure.
But just to go back to...
No, I think we should do a conceptual piece here sometime while the show's on and play the 100 hours solid. And those of it, that's fine.
But I think that you were alluding to Paul's networks, really.
Yeah.
He was incredibly widely networked, but he had a very Catholic outlook on art. He likes lots of different kinds of things. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why he was invited to teach at the Royal College of Art, which was then under Peter de Francia in the Department of Painting, who was an out-and-out figurative artist. And here was Paul, who was a very abstract artist. But Peter recognized that Paul had very wide tastes. And in fact, I think he talked to him about Guston, late Guston at the time. And suddenly, de Francia thought, well, actually, this is the right person here. And then we're going to talk about his teaching, I guess, but when he was teaching, he brought all sorts of people to come in part-time or as guest lecturers to talk about things. So in spite of the very rigorous approach to painting, his interests were incredibly wide.
But can I jump in there? Because Paul did say that it was through, and because we're transitioning into your contribution to art education, it was through the art schools that you did broaden your sort of reach. It was really those networks with artists of all tendencies. That came through working alongside those artists. Is that right?
That's very true. As a young student, I was extremely prejudiced and didn't choose to have discussions with anyone whose work I didn't approve of. So the range of my friendship was extremely narrow, even though in my early years here in the Royal Academy schools, the then curator of the schools, after about 2 months, passed me by and stopped and put his hand on his hip and he said, "Every time I walk through the studio, you're standing there talking to somebody, and when you bloody well going to do some work?" And of course I was deeply embarrassed and pulled up my socks a bit. But thinking about it since, although I've done a huge amount of teaching in my life, I've never denied the fact that students learn more from each other than they do from their teachers. And even though it undermines my role as an educator, that's the truth of it. And so I wasn't doing the wrong thing in spending my time chatting away to other students. It was vitally important because that's where you learn.
And is that how you implemented your own teaching regimes? You encouraged students to talk to each other and be critical of each other?
You can't make them do that.
Well, you can in the crit, I suppose. But so
yes,
you
find each other. But certainly, I tried to keep a broad table, and I never wanted students to work the way I work, in fact, I probably shied away from them a little bit if they made the kind of work that looked a bit like mine, I was probably a bit unfair to them.
I'm curious about your prejudices. So who were your bêtes noires then when you were a student? Yeah, who was the enemy?
The Slade, goldsmiths. I have every respect for Michael Craig Martin. He's got an amazing show on here, but please, don't encourage anyone to go and look at that before they come in here, because they'll be colourblind by the time they come in here. I'd rather they look in here first. But anyway, Michael, as you know, was hugely influential at Goldsmiths, and they got a very big name for themselves. I think my students did just as well, but there wasn't a school of painting that came out of the time when I was professor there.
But amazing artists, Chris Ofili, Hervin Anderson, Jake
amazing.
Chapman, Tracy Emin. Yes. You're not bitter, clearly, but is there an edge to just wishing that the Royal College had been recognised more, or was its pluralism its strength?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
Do you have a certain resentment, minor, that the Royal College wasn't recognised in the same coherent way that Goldsmiths was, or is its pluralism
Not
its strength?
really. I was a little jealous of Goldsmiths, but it didn't matter because the students working in my painting school were brilliant, and I knew it, and they were going somewhere in their own way. No.
Well, interestingly enough, I think Paul's students have gone further than the Goldsmith students. I mean, if you think of Chris Ofili, Tracy Emin, Peter Doig, was he a student or just a teacher? He just taught there under you. But pretty
Yeah, I don't want to have a
amazing.
face. I don't think Damien's done badly. I don't think.
But I think actually it's worth going back to the beginnings again and thinking about why Paul perhaps was such a successful educator. And perhaps that was to do with the extraordinary trajectory that he followed from this incredibly rigorous training he had at Harrow at Junior Art School, learning how to draw, learning all the different techniques, going to the Royal Academy schools, being very rebellious, doing his own abstract work at home and faking the life room stuff to pass the exams. But I think more than that, he was involved in incredibly experimental and progressive episodes, which, looking back at Paul's trajectory now, I'm like, it's an interesting sort of case study for the history of art education in this country, because Paul was there with Harry Thubron and Victor Pasmore when they were doing the most progressive experimental courses on the theory of colour before the sort of general curriculum was overhauled by the Coldstream reforms. And Paul was already pioneering new approaches to teaching based on ideas from abstract design, from his own research and from his sort of encounters with Thubron. So I think, just reflecting on his later triumphs, it goes all the way back to this incredibly broad-based education that he had received.
It was a good time to be an art student. I don't think they get such a good time today, very sadly. As has been said, I went to something called Junior Art School at the age of 13. You can't do that today. I don't advocate that young people should have to make up their minds about their career that young, but if you're dunce at everything else, you do what I do and follow the one talent you got up your sleeve. And so I went to Junior Art School, and it benefited me enormously. I was so miserable doing other subjects, terrible at maths, terrible at everything else.
Says the former treasurer of the Royal Academy. Yeah. You're pretty good here at that, I have to say.
I bluffed my way through.
One of the really eye-opening moments in the book, there are quite a few actually, is the acknowledgement that there was a period of crisis, a kind of creative block in the mid-70s. And that must happen in many careers, but it's rarely articulated. So let's get the writer's perspective, and then let's get yours. Just contextualise 74, 75, this moment of creative block.
Yeah, so Paul had been incredibly successful. He'd had sell-out shows at the Rowan Gallery, which was his one and only gallery for many, many years until it actually
Closed up, yeah.
closed down. And then there was a moment when he did a couple of shows which didn't go quite so well. And I think he felt, well, I'm putting words into your mouth, but I think he felt, I've got to change in some way. He had already changed, of course, from doing those paintings and the paintings with the more linear motifs when he felt that other people were sort of moving into that area, and he felt he needed to move on from that. But I think what was special about the mid-70s was at that time, I don't think he knew what direction he wanted to go in. And so he went back to the beginning. He went back to Cubism. He went back to Surrealism, which had been early influences, and really investigated and analyzed them, even to the extent of making a copy of Man Leaning on the Table by Picasso, which was one of the great synthetic Cubist paintings. And moving on from then. So he changed direction at that point. And I think that's actually an incredibly brave thing to do. Some artists have done it famously, like Guston, who changed direction and made a success of it. Others change direction and don't make a success of it, and they're sort of floundering around for a long time. But Paul, I think, found his voice again in an incremental way. He had to work through it. And it was a working through. I mean, to go back to the sort of psychoanalytical theme that you brought up, but there was a working through, I think, of something that was a bit traumatic.
Do you still, can you remember the fear? Do you still, when you go into the studio, is there ever a fear of not being able to work, to have a creative block again?
I guess certainly there's a challenge. I mean, there's the white page syndrome that I understand writers face, and there's a white canvas syndrome that artists have to face. Having said that, I love blank canvases.
It's opportunity.
It's opportunity, and sometimes I often work in series, usually, and so I have a number of canvases ready, waiting, and they're the same size, and I often put a blank, primed white canvas next to a painting I'm working on, and it's the blank canvas that's the challenge. Try and make something look as good as that. I know it sounds ridiculous. No, it's like somebody said to me once that great wine really tastes like water, and I know what they mean, that you can guzzle it because it's so wonderful, and a blank canvas is like that. It's better than any painting.
Fail better. Yeah, you violate the blank canvas, but try and do it better. It's interesting you raised the issue about being a serial artist. You work in series, and that's apparent, and it's very clear and beautifully illustrated and discussed in the book. So there is a sense of linearity, that a series is finished and then you move to the next series. When you look back at work, do you ever get a sense of possibility or of irresolution? Do you look back at a series and think, actually, there was more to do in that series?
Absolutely, I do, yes. And I have great guilt about that because somehow I've got in my DNA the idea that one has to move on. But I own a lot of my own work, principally because I haven't sold a great deal of it. But so it's there in storage in my basement, and I often look at it, and I think, why did I stop doing those? Because I can think of 3 others that would fit into that series. But should I paint them now? Is it too late? Would it be unfair to do that? Am I breaking some sort of promise that I had ended that group of works and moved to something different? Perhaps you can give me advice on that. What do you think?
Let's make a studio visit. I think that the postmodern condition gives not just license, it encourages that. But I love your description, quoted by Jeremy in the book, that postmodernism is modernism having a late midlife crisis. I think it's a brilliant description, rather than pluralism and anything is possible or anything goes. just because of time and structure is one of your subjects. Studios. I want to talk just briefly about studios. Hester, you can give us the trajectory of Paul's studios. You don't have to give exact dates, but we've got Primrose Hill, Arbroath, Hammersmith.
Well, the most interesting long-lived studio was the
New York.
Chalk Farm studio, which Paul shared. I mean, talk about mapping a life in art. I mean, your companions or your cohabitants at Chalk Farm were extraordinary, weren't they? You mentioned Michael Craig Martin was in there at some point. Philip King for many years. Yes. We could talk about Philip, affinities
Rita
between
Donner.
Your work. Rita Donner.
Stephen Buckley.
Yep. Peter Kalkoff. I mean, so many people went. I would say that was probably the studio of your career. Is that right, Paul?
Oh, sure. The longest one. I mean, I think I was there 29 years.
But there were so many other studios. The studio in Canal Street, where you had Sherman Dunn, your Chinese landlord, and you got into calligraphy. Painting calligraphy, didn't you? And then you went much later. You go back to that when you revisit your.
That was a game with the children. I didn't really do calligraphy.
But you were, yeah. So there were.
But Brian
what about
visited
other
you in
studios?
Ealing, was it? In Ealing, you had a studio in your mother's old house.
No.
Where did Brian visit you first? In '63 or '4?
When I lived in Chiswick.
Chiswick, that's what I mean. Chiswick,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
And what about when, was it Motherwell came to your studio in Chiswick?
He did, yes, with his wife, Helen Frankenthaler. I was terribly nervous, of course, entertaining such major figures in the art world. And they were very gentle with me, I think. We made the mistake of giving them a pretty awful dinner, I think. I mean, why give Americans roast beef when beef is their staple diet?
Well, he wrote you a bloody good reference for the Harkness, didn't he? So he didn't hold it against you.
Didn't put him off.
And it was Brian who introduced you to... Sorry? It was Brian who introduced you to Motherwell.
He introduced me to many artists, including Robert Motherwell.
Barnett Newman, Mark Rothko. He introduced you to Barnett Newman, Mark Rothko.
Yes.
Robert Motherwell, Helen Frankenthaler.
Lee Krasner.
You're not getting away from the
Barnett
question.
Newman.
Yeah, we'll come back to them in a minute. Scotland. You had a studio in Scotland for a time. Briefly, and in New York.
Yes.
Did that sense of being in a different place have a fundamental impact on your work? Or wherever you are in the studio, you're working on what your concerns are? The external environment is not that important?
I think when you get a change of surroundings, I think there was an influence in being in a different place. I love the countryside. Nothing against artists who go out and live in Somerset or something like that, but I've always slightly feared the idea that landscape will come into my work, because I've noticed that there's something English about the people who go off to Cornwall and Somerset and Devon and so on. They kind of, even if they're abstract paintings, they do sort of landscape paintings. And I'm a city person, really. They go a bit horizontal, and I'm a vertical artist.
But the paintings you did in Scotland were influenced by the ploughed field that was outside your window, I remember you saying. And the paintings that you did in New York, the colours changed when you went to New York.
I mean, imagine what if I stayed there longer. I mean, there's ploughed fields, green leaves, red poppies.
Yeah, well, you didn't replicate the ploughed fields, but the colour changed.
Can I interject quickly while we're thinking about architectural spaces and Paul's paintings? I have a memory of you telling me that Alex Gregory Hood, who we probably could talk about for a little bit longer.
The Rowan Gallery.
Exactly, and an incredible sort of champion of his artists, supporter of artists, actually modified his gallery premises to fit your 9-foot square canvases through. Is that correct?
He moved galleries from Knightsbridge to Mayfair while I was living in New York, and he knew I was painting I mean, I just went mad when I went to New York because I'd been living and working previously in a, I suppose you'd call it an Edwardian semi in Chiswick, and using the best room as my studio. And so when I got to New York, I damn well got myself a proper loft and made the biggest works I wanted to, which were 9 foot square in both directions. Where was I going with that? Yes, Alex moved galleries then, and he had an architect to carry out the conversion, and the entrance doorway went straight onto a landing and then down a staircase. You could stand on the landing and look over the main gallery, but you couldn't get a 9-foot canvas beyond the doorway at an angle. And he had the architect build a kind of balcony with a diagonal hole in it, so that a painting leaning at 45 degrees could go through the doorway, through the balcony, and into the gallery. So yes, he reshaped it or instructed the architect
Very
to accommodate.
accommodating of him.
I think that's what's interesting. Sorry, to go back to your studio in New York. When you came back here, you, after a while, moved into the Primrose Hill studio.
Yes, almost.
Which was a sort of loft-type space.
Yes.
And I think there was a change then in the kinds of studios that artists had. We're actually going to be doing a talk about this on the 14th of November in Primrose Hill with Michael Craig Martin, who was a fellow studio.
And a fellow Rowan Gallery artist too.
Yes, absolutely. But it was a sudden change, I think, in the kind of architecture of artist studios, that they took semi-industrial spaces that were no longer in use as industrial spaces, as opposed to working in the front room or the back room of a house. Obviously the Victorian studios were very large and lofty, but they weren't available to young artists. So it was a seminal moment, I think, and it was the New York influence in this architecture.
Absolutely.
That did that.
We learned from the Americans. And Dick Smith, Richard Smith, the painter, who had been a Harkness scholar a couple of years ahead of me, came back and got what I thought was the first loft-style space in London, somewhere near Old Street. I thought it was enormous and wonderful. I went back to it like 4 years later, and I thought it was pretty pokey, really.
But you talked quite a lot also about the Derek Jarman's studio in the Butler's Wharf warehouse, and how, I mean, that was one of the very first sort of big industrial spaces, wasn't it? And how he had to put an insulated shed in there to keep warm in because it was so cold. But it was the site of all the legendary parties, Miss World parties, and
that's right,
the Logan crowd.
And Peter Logan was there, and they pioneered those very dark, damp, huge studio spaces. I never went actually to Catherine Stock, which was initiated by Bridget Riley, another scheme where artists gathered together within one huge building. That was very seminal and important. Butler's Wharf, where Derek was, and Peter Logan was across the river from there.
It's funny, you mentioned not wanting landscape to creep into your work. I remember actually having a similar conversation with Tony Caro about why he never wanted his work to be shown outdoors in sculpture parks. He felt that landscape would intrude too much, and eventually he showed it at Chatsworth and was kind of relieved it was okay. But I was thinking about format and scale with you, because you've often used the square, and of course the square can not be co-opted so easily into landscape nor portraiture. It can be both or neither.
That's exactly why I use it, and I very seldom make a rectangular painting, and usually because circumstances force it on me and I'm reluctant to do so. But square is what inspires my inventions, and because of exactly what you've said, Tim, it doesn't create a condition of implied landscape or figure. I mean, we traditionally, and in photography, talk about the format as being landscape or portrait, and that's become common language. But it is true, I believe, perhaps others don't agree, but if you start with a canvas that's rectangular, upright or horizontal, you've got the beginning of a subject matter, and I don't want that. I want my own subject matter, and I think that's something that's worth talking about, is subject matter in abstract painting. Can there be such a thing? Do you believe, Tim?
Well, I do, because it can express emotion in all sorts of ways. It can express mythology or mythological tragedy in abstracted ways. It's perfectly possible to have subject matter, but not... I mean, I love that quote again. Jeremy quotes you quoting Paul Valery about bad poetry it descends into meaning, doesn't it, in the end? So but we have a tendency, and I'm often guilty of it, I think art historians, curators often are, of over-interpreting. We want to make sense of things systematically by the influences we see, and that sometimes loses nuance and it accrues meaning in more literal ways to works of art than actually are not there, are unintended. But I like the fact that in the book, Jeremy doesn't shy away from influence and works that you've been looking at and things that are triggers for that, but it doesn't over-interpret where those works have come from. And I think the idea of thinking just going back to format and square, again, you're fairly singular in this regard, but having consistently from early 70s, dividing a painting into two, and there is a kind of dialogue within your own paintings between forms, so there's meaning there, there's a subject matter there, but the subject matter is intrinsic to the painting.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's what... I see my works as inventions, and I believe I try and put subject matter into the work, and a dialogue is the best way to involve an audience, I think, because if you put two parts together that may not agree with each other, you're inviting the audience to kind of be the interviewer, the interpreter of that, and they have to make some sort of assessment or judgment about what the relationships are. And before you know where you are, you're into the painting.
Paul says he's not a storyteller, Jeremy, and you say that his paintings are interrogative. They pose questions, and I suppose that most literally there's a conversation or a questioning within the painting, literally in the structure.
Yeah, and I think Paul will be the first to say that actually that idea was inspired by theatre. He went and saw the Bunraku Japanese theatre, and he's a big theatre goer. So, dialogue and drama are all present in the paintings. So I think the idea of splitting the painting actually emerges in quite a subtle way before it's more literal in the paintings of the late 60s and early 70s, where the paintings are not subdivided in the way that you see them there, but there are different kinds of motifs. There are, if you like, black rectangles disposed in one way, and then a coloured grid on either in the top right-hand corner or going down the side of the painting. And the idea of dividing the painting comes out of that, and it did specifically come from this experience of seeing Bunraku theatre, where there were puppets on the stage and a band on the right-hand side, and somebody who was voicing a story sort of off stage. And it was, you, as the audience, you had to put that together for yourself. And I think that's the sort of idea that's going right through Paul's work from the late 60s onwards, is this way of combining different and disparate elements which create a conversation out of which you as the viewer can construct some kind of meaning.
Your work is emphatically two-dimensional in the way you've realised it, but again, I realised from the book that you've made sculpture, and also, tragically, you did a commission for King's Cross. I remember it, and then it no longer exists. Working tiles at King's Cross Station. What do you learn from working three-dimensionally? And is there, in your work, is there not much of a distinction between the way you work two and three-dimensionally, or are they fundamentally different? Because Jeremy, talking about theatre is interesting, because of course that is a distillation from something that is three and fourth dimensions.
What said was true about the influence of Japanese theatre. I can't deny that. I felt that continually I was making paintings which were determinedly flat, but at the same time implied a sculptural form that you could believe in or looked impossible if it was a sculpture because it wouldn't stand up. And a sort of game involved in that. And then I was challenged. I was asked to make some sculpture, which I did and enjoyed doing enormously, but I realized I'd been doing it all along in paintings. I'm not a sculptor, though. I quickly discovered what the problems are. A, storage. What do you do with the bloody things?
Well, that's quite a practical starting point, yeah.
And B, how do you get them through doorways if you make them too big? I mean, canvases are relatively easy by comparison, and I thought, it must be a nightmare being a sculptor, so I don't make many sculptures.
But
they're heavy too.
I mean, and here was me thinking that wonderful story that involves Helen Frankenthaler and Tony Caro, where they swapped studios for a time. Yeah. And Helen Frankenthaler made sculptures using Tony's assistants, and he was very generous and said they were interesting sculptures. He then said when he went to a studio, he made a mark on the canvas and then wanted to move it, so he had to cut it out, and then he made another mark and then needed to cut that out. So he reverted to assemblage and collage from where his work came. I'm curious about size, scale, practicalities, getting it through the door. The process of making sculpture for you, which was often done with in collage process, did it feel fundamentally different to that which you realized in painting? I'm really struck by the fact that some of the paintings actually you feel are sculptures that couldn't actually exist. Were you trying to subconsciously make things that you'd already painted that could exist in three-dimensional form?
When I made the sculptures,
yeah.
So I was. I was guided by a wonderful memory of having a conversation with Barnett Newman in New York, who at the time was working on the broken obelisk, which is a wonderful sculpture with an impossible sort of balance. It's like a pyramid, with an obelisk, like a Cleopatra's needle turned over, and the point of it balancing on the top of a pyramid. And he told me how it was solved eventually, because it has to be supported by something running from one unit to the other. And he found an engineer who worked on the construction of aeroplane wings, and there's a special kind of metal that was possible to use and have a rod going through that was the thinnest possible rod with the toughest strength to it. And I guess that was always at the back of my mind when I started making sculptures, because if you wanted to make a sculpture out of one of those paintings we've got over there, you'd have to somehow cheat. You couldn't kind of expect them to float. You have to join them up physically. And that's what has to be done. But I think it gets a bit tiresome in the end. You can paint whatever you want to paint, but you can't sculpt whatever you want to sculpt, because it will fall down if you...
Jeremy?
Yeah, I was wondering, you showed at Roche Court with Joel Shapiro.
Yes.
He was in the garden, and he made sculptures which are not a million miles away from those kinds of things.
It was a good choice of invited artists to go together. Unfortunately, he never came across for his own exhibition, so I was showing as a neighbour with him. And Madeleine Ponsonby made that choice, and I thought it was a good one.
So there was a synergy between the work, and also you knew David Smith, who, again, there is some kind of relationship between his Cubi work and
Yes,
these kinds of works.
absolutely, yes.
And he was another person who, in a sense, kind of cheated because, of course, he welded the shapes together. They couldn't possibly be self-supporting. So it's an interesting parallel.
That word you used, game, I think, is quite pertinent because I think there is a sense of humour in a lot of your work, Paul. You love to laugh. You're always quick to laugh. And I feel that this threads through your life and your work. Is there something playful in some of them?
I hope so, but that doesn't belie the fact that I'm very serious about them, and they're serious paintings, but I think humour is part of being serious in a funny way. It's just...
Serious play. What about painting as environment, Paul? I mean, the mosaics you did, or the work on the tiles at King's Cross, is that something you wish you'd had the opportunity to do more of? Engaging work at a larger scale to make environments or spaces or places in the public domain?
I wasn't too keen on working with tiles, really, which were a necessity. But it was a very interesting challenge to do that. Incidentally, you say it's no longer there. I don't know what happened. It just disappeared overnight after about, 10 years or so. And I don't know what they did to it. Well, since then, though, excuse me, I have made what Sol LeWitt was pleased to brand wall drawings. We don't like murals any longer. And I've done 4 or 5, I'm not sure, major pieces of work on walls, all of them painted over. They never lived for long, not against my wishes. I wanted them to be temporary, and I love doing those.
Why did you want them to be temporary? I mean, why did you want them to be temporary?
I think public art should be temporary. There's too much rubbish that's made public.
Tell us what you think. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that your King's Cross murals, or if you call them murals, survived the King's Cross fire, but they didn't survive TfL.
We've just got about 10 minutes. If people want to ask questions to the floor, there's much more we can do. But other questions people would like to ask Paul, to add to the 101 hours of interviews that's already taken place. There's a mic coming around. No, there isn't. Yeah.
No.
I can go on. I'll do it.
Can you give him a mic?
I was just going to say, if you was to give advice to a younger artist, what would it be?
So if you were to give advice to a younger artist, what would it be? And presumably you have done as a teacher, but now what would your advice be to a younger artist?
Find a sponsor. Beyond most people's reach. Be tenacious. Look at everything, even if you feel prejudiced against it. I come across a lot of young artists, and when I've been in discussion with them, I've said, have you seen such and such an exhibition? They said, no. I said, why not? And they say, I'm afraid of being influenced by it. And I always give them a hard time then. Absolute rubbish. If you're going to be influenced, let yourself be influenced while you're developing. And it'll do you no harm. And also, if you go to see an exhibition of work you don't like or don't approve of, you know much more about it having seen it, rather than be critical and not having seen it. It's ridiculous to be critical without having seen something. Look at everything you can look at and give yourself a visual education. It's not a simple thing to do. We know what literary education is like, and it's hugely fruitful and beneficial, but nobody clearly can spell out what a visual education, building a visual language and learning to read paintings is like. That's what we have to do, learn to read paintings, learn what they're saying without having the words spelt out.
Well spoken. Just quickly, what was the last show you saw that you thought was awful but you learnt from?
That's a cruel question. Sitting in this building.
It wouldn't be here, would it, obviously?
Oh, can you ask me that again?
You're not going to get up. What was the last show that you saw that you thought was awful but that you learnt from?
You've stumped me. You have stumped me. I'm sorry.
All right, tell me over dinner then. We'll let you off the hook. And what was the last show you saw that was revelatory? Because you've seen a lot of shows, and therefore, in a sense, often seeing a show confirms something you already think. But what was the last revelatory show you saw?
I would say the Rothko show in Paris.
Freetown Foundation, yeah.
That, I mean, I thought I knew Rothko's work. I knew him. I saw his paintings in his studio. I saw him working on the Dominial Chapel in
Houston,
Houston, Texas. But and I thought I knew his early work, but that was the revelationary thing for me. That there was very skillfully. There were about 3 rooms that showed his evolution from making figurative work to going through a kind of biomorphic surrealism, and then on to the work that we all recognize. And I thought that was extraordinary, and it meant a lot to me to see those great artists.
Yeah.
Hi. So, Paul, could you just briefly talk to us about your relationship with color? Just having looked at the arc of your work recently, you have both kind of a scientific relationship with color and also a poetic relationship with color, and you seem to be able to create colors that I haven't even seen before in different nuances. So I just want to, talk to me a little bit about the process of your kind of vocabulary and color.
Well, that's an interesting question. I did go on a very beneficial brief course one summer when I was a student here in the Royal Academy, and I was about 18 then, conducted by Harry Thubron and Victor Passmore that were mentioned here in this discussion. And the subject was colour, and I learned a lot. It wasn't about colour theory, it was about colour experience, really. But I did learn how to hold a vocabulary of colour in my head. We all know about colour wheels and how they've been developed into a colour solid, as they call it, to be able to categorise colour. And I found that very useful. And I used to walk around with, as it were, something like a large melon-like fruit in my head, which categorised all colours that you could dream of, with a central grey core going through it, moving out to brighter colours into the sort of infinity of fluorescent colours beyond. And I do sometimes I don't know if I've done it recently, but certainly through later years, I used to make little diagrams plotting the colours in my work so that I understood the pattern of relationships between them in the structure of colour. Yeah, you could call that scientific, I guess, but I did find that of value to do that.
And what about the question about colours that you've never quite encountered before?
Right. I mean, it seems like I think of Anne Truitt in some ways too, and that she's associated color so much with poetics or certain memories or the way that light interacts based on kind of social experiences or your own kind of emotional experiences. In your work, it seems that you kind of, and maybe that's something private that you maybe you don't want to reveal so much that maybe the paintings themselves reveal, but it seems like you have this innate scientific understanding, but then also you're able to kind of subtly give us a little bit of emotional poetry too. Not too much, but just enough.
I find that hard to talk about.
Yeah, I figured.
Please.
What I think you haven't mentioned though is how you push colour from, you take a red and a green or something, and you push them into an extraordinary realms of where you go with them. So thank you.
So Susie's just saying Paul pushes colour in quite forceful ways.
And it goes throughout the whole of your paintings. Sorry.
Well, some artists are categorized as colorists. I wouldn't mind being called a colorist, but I never have been. I think that's quite a flattering term, but the artists that are called colorists tend to use all colors at the maximum intensity. And I wouldn't dream of doing that because I don't think you're really talking about color in any constructive way. If you be working that way.
It's a dialogue with colour and form,
The
isn't it?
interesting thing about your use of colour, Paul, is while there is, if you like, colour theory behind it, it's quite intuitive as well. And between, I don't know if everybody knows this, but Paul does drawings for every painting, and they go from black and white sketches to relatively large colour sheets. And between the sort of last colour sheet and the painting, there can be quite substantial changes in tones and even colour, so that when you get to the final canvas, it's not necessarily going to replicate what's in the original sketch.
Right. Yes.
So it's it's about how do colours behave with each other?
Yes.
What do they do to each other? And do I have to adapt the colour in order for it to stay flat, for example, or in order for it to not stay flat? Do I want it? Do I want some space to occur in there?
Well,
But colour's not there, or is colour there at the beginning? In those initial drawings, which are pencil drawings, is colour still implicitly there, even though it's not visually rendered?
it's not. It's not. It's just black ink on little sketch pads.
So form,
So it's
structure.
structure, and then colour.
Yeah.
Is that bad? I'm not sure.
It's neither good or bad, it's fact. Great, next question.
We had
Yeah.
a lady in the
There's a-
front
there's a-
with a question.
Gentleman at the back, yeah.
Yes.
Gentleman at the back.
Oh
Jock
God,
McFadden.
he's an artist.
That's no gentleman, it's Jock McFadden, yeah.
Hi, Paul.
Hello. I knew you'd be trouble when I saw you
yeah.
coming in the room.
When I came in, you were talking about Brian Robertson. And I've talked to a few people who are a bit older than me, and they've talked about the 1958 show Jackson Pollock, which was at the Whitechapel Art Gallery, and how it hit them. And I wondered what it was like for you.
I remember that show vividly.
And also designed by Trevor Dannett, the architect who designed
I think he designed the walls in the Whitechapel, which built of breeze blocks. Imagining putting walls in a gallery made of breeze blocks, that's kind of an original idea, but absolutely right, because nothing could be worse than a flimsy bit of hardboard or something as a dividing wall in the gallery, and it really looked good structurally. But the paintings, wow. Number one, that was a great painting, and Lavender Mist, and extraordinary works.
So was that show more influential than the Tate show the following year, which was the
New American
painting, which had
The Tate show had a variety of artists in it, so they didn't speak with such a loud voice as the Pollock show did. But the Whitechapel was a great avant-garde thrust in London that nobody serious about painting or art could miss. And
but the New American painting was probably the first time you saw Barnett Newman.
Yes, definitely.
Which must have had a big impact.
First time I saw Barnett Newman, Mark Rothko, Clifford Still, Basiotis.
Gorky, yeah.
Gorky.
We haven't mentioned John Hoyland, and I don't think an evening discussing abstract painting at the Royal Academy should pass without his mention of John. John was a fellow student of yours.
And a great friend.
Yeah. What did you learn from each other?
Good and bad things. We learnt to ridicule other artists' work because John was so funny. He was one of the 2 or 3 people in my life who made me laugh so much my rib cage ached. Brian Robertson was another, and Adrian Berg was another. I don't know if you knew Adrian very well, but he was hilarious. And
So what was the bad thing then that you... So that was the good thing that you and...
the bad thing was ridiculing other work. I mean,
checking. So what was the good thing then?
He was very ambitious, John, and I guess I collected some ambition from him. I believe Hester once asked me what I aimed to do in a painting. It was in a conversation, Hester, and I said, try and make a painting that annoyed John Hoyland as much as possible.
But
Sadly, he's no longer there to annoy.
He also pointed you in the direction of Harry Thubron's course, because he did it the year before, and that was a very important moment for you.
Yes, he didn't go the year I did, but he went the year before, I think.
Right.
He was also a Primrose Hill artist.
Down the road, in the same street, yes.
Did Clement Greenberg ever visit the studio?
Yes. Yes.
And how was that?
It was infuriating to me because Clement Greenberg wanted to interfere with his coterie of young artists, or younger artists.
He was very prescriptive, wasn't he? You should move that and do that.
Exactly. You ever witness that? Or
No, just I heard it from people.
He always wore a hat, and he used to take his hat off and mask off a bit of a painting and close one eye. I can't imagine anything more inappropriate than a circle to mask something off. And he'd say, why don't you crop off the left-hand side of that? And he wanted artists to conform to his ideas, and he was successful in that. I've got a lot of theories about that. My argument about the artists he had heavy influence on was that they were making something that I equated with photography, oddly enough. They were artists who were making very free-flowing gestural painting with very liquid, fluid substances and so on. But they used to make huge paintings on the floor usually. And he would come in with the other group and they'd decide on how that big canvas should be cropped, which bit. Nothing's more similar than framing a photograph, looking at a bit of nature and masking off a window and choosing the bit that you think makes the most satisfactory composition. He used to do that with artist paintings. I didn't take his advice, and he didn't talk to me much after that.
Okay, question there. Michael.
Good evening. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Michael. Hi. Oh, my goodness. Michael, I knew you were coming tonight, but I wasn't sure if you were in the audience. Good evening.
I'm hiding back here. Paul, you and I have known each other since the 60s when my first show at the Rowan.
That's right. I remember it very fondly.
But actually, I knew your work in America before I ever came to England.
Really?
Yeah, I knew your work when I was a student in New York. And
did you see a show of mine at Cornbury Gallery?
Yes, that's right.
I had a couple of shows there. Really?
Yes, I remember. I mean, it's interesting from that time how well known British art was in New York. We knew, when I came to England, I knew most of the artists' work because I'd seen it in New York at that time. There was a lot of exchange between America and England at the time.
Yeah.
But I don't have a question, but there's something I feel hasn't been said, and it's my own observation about your work always. I think of you in terms of balance. Everything you do is extraordinarily subtly balanced. There's a balance of the forms. And when you talk about the color, look at the colors in the paintings in the room. They're so delicately balanced. Everything is just, it's finding a right note of balance between things. And that's a very special gift.
Thank you. Thank you. That's, I'm very, very flattered to hear you say that. More and more I've got interested in these strange structures that, as you say, are balanced, intentionally, precariously balanced. And when I made the first ones, which were for a big wall drawing in Venice, it was intended to indirectly refer to threat, because balancing acts are dangerous. You know, the juggler who balances a flaming torch on his nose or something like that, and those wonderful pyramids of people where in the end the little boy climbs right up to the top. Terrifying, threatening. You're afraid that you wish it was all over and everyone gets down safely. But then I realized that it's also entertainment. And so I can make paintings that describe precarious balance, and they can be threatening to a certain extent. That's what I see these big paintings on the side of the room about. Or they can be amusing, and they can be entertaining. They can kind of hold both sides of the axis.
Michael, when you saw Paul's work, and it's a long time to remember, but did they seem British, American? None of those things. How did you see them? Because obviously there was a kind of marketing around British painting, but there was a strong transatlantic dialogue in abstraction, as there had been for the previous decade, between British and American art. Do you remember how you saw them?
My memory is that it was a period of British abstraction. There was also pop paintings coming to America from Britain, but I'm thinking of John Hoyland and also Tony Caro, Philip King. There were sculptors and painters, and there was it's not easy to use the word minimal anymore, but where there's just a few forms, a few colors, a very simplified kind of painting. That was, and sculpture of that period. So that's fitted into, it wouldn't have been seen in America if it hadn't fitted into some kind of American dialogue.
Yeah, that's interesting. We've run out of time. It's very interesting and telling, I think, that many of the questions from the floor came from fellow artists, and that idea about Paul's being respected by and flourishing in the company of artists is a lovely note on which to end. Paul, there's many more series to complete, so you better get on and do it. There's probably hours more questions that we could ask you, although Hester's 100 hours is pretty impressive. But thank you so much for doing this. Congratulations to all three of you on the book. You've sold quite a few. The book's going to be available, I think, in the Royal Academy from now on in. If anyone wants to get a copy now that they haven't got a copy, I'm sure Paul can be persuaded to sign it. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Tim.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sure you'll all agree that was a complete privilege to hear that exceedingly insightful conversation tonight. So thank you, Paul. Thank you, Tim and Hester and Jeremy and Alison and George at the team at the Royal Academy. Thank you for hosting tonight. As Tim rightly said, we're at a book launch. They're for sale. They're $49.99, under £50. Paul is going to be here Friday, Saturday and Sunday. Signing books, and please do spread the word. Come back and see Paul and ask whatever other questions that you may have. Thank you for coming.